Wow, what a fantastic crowd and what a wonderful event. I get to moderate a panel of two of my favorite people. And let me start off by thanking AM and the SFU Van City Office of Community Engagement for hosting this and so many other fantastic events. It's just, you guys are a really important part of our civic culture here in Vancouver, so thanks so much for what you do. The genesis of this event is Andrew MacLeod's wonderful book, which is called A Better Place on Earth, The Search for Fairness in Super Unequal British Columbia. And we'll be telling you all about the book as we go, and you'll be hearing from Andrew. But I wanted to just talk a little bit about how that book came into being, because I think in the story is a little bit about some of the aspects of civil society that can make a difference in making our society more just and equal. One is that Andrew made a choice. He's a very talented journalist, and ever since I first met him, when he sent me an email and he was working at Monday Magazine, it was clear that Andrew just couldn't resist writing the kinds of pieces that were probably not going to make him rich, but would make a big difference. He was writing, the first I met him, he was writing about, I'll use the word scam because I think that's kind of at the level it was at, where the provincial government had decided to cancel the job training programs that were in place and replace them with a more privatized version. And that left open all kinds of actually rather complex, the devil in the details type of ways to cook the numbers and make it seem like these programs were effective when in fact they weren't. And it took Andrew's amazing ability to conceptualize policy as well as talk to regular folks at the ground level to bring that story to light. And I think it turned into a 4-part series or something like that, and we were privileged to publish it. So I think, one aspect of it is that we have people like Andrew who are very talented and they're motivated by things other than money, but that doesn't mean that Andrew should not be in at least the top 86%. I think you deserve that. And when you work for the Tyee, that's about where you come in. Yeah. Then the reason he was able to do, and the reason he was able to come work at the Tyee is that the Tyee was founded in part by the labor movement of BC. Basically, some of our seed funding and ongoing investment comes from a venture capital fund that is labor affiliated. And so I really think if you read Andrew's book, you'll see that the labor movement is a big part of maintaining a middle class in Canada and slowing down at least the trend towards inequality. So I'm proud to be part of a publication that had those roots at the labor movement. Andrew's actual project was paid for by a sister organization for the Tyee called the Tyee Solutions Society, and the co-founder of the Tyee Solutions Society is here tonight. It's Michelle Hoare, and right there in the back. And she started it in 2009 with me, and the idea there was could we attract some extra funding for public interest journalism. And we have published dozens of major investigative and solutions-focused pieces thanks to the generosity of foundations and labor unions and private donors. And so I think that's a kind of a philanthropic part of civil society that needs to be acknowledged. And then finally, I think we should thank Howard White and Harbor Publishing for seeing that this series that Andrew did could become a fantastic book. And I think BC is really blessed with small publishing houses that keep non-celebrity oriented topics being discussed and talked about in depth through a really rich, steady procession of books. And so I feel privileged to live in British Columbia where Harbor Publishing and so many other small publishers exist. So I think those are all elements of why BC is not the worst place on earth, even if it could be a better place. let me quickly introduce the two panelists and tell you how the evening's going to go, okay? So Andrew MacLeod and Iglika Ivanova are going to be our panelists, and I'll introduce them both now, and then I'll tell you how it's all going to go. Andrew is the legislative bureau chief for the Tyee, and I explained how we came together. I don't know, now 8 years ago or something like that?
2003, 2004, I think was the first series I wrote for you, and then full-time since 2007.
Yeah, so long time. And he's just been vital for the Tyee. His work has been referred to in the BC Legislature, Canadian House of Commons, and the Senate. It's been referred to in threatening letters from the provincial government that have landed directly on my desk, threatening to put us in jail. It's been referred to a lot by interesting people. He won a 2006 Association of Alternative News Weeklies Award for news writing and was a finalist for the 2007 Western Magazine Award for Best Article in BC and the Yukon, and his reporting has appeared in the Tyee and also Monday Magazine, the Georgia Straight, BC Business, 24 Hours, San Francisco Bay Guardian, Detroit's Metro Times, Portland's Willamette Week. Iglika Ivanova, a lot of you will know her. She is a senior economist and public interest researcher with the BC office of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. She researches and writes on some of the key challenges facing our province, including poverty and economic insecurity, income inequality, low-wage work, and the relationship between taxation, government spending on programs and services, and quality of life. Just that. Iglika is a frequent media commentator on social and economic policy issues and a blogger on policynote.ca, and she is particularly interested in the potential for public policy to shape a more just and sustainable economic future for all of us. As I said, it's Andrew's book that is the catalyst for this evening, and basically his book makes the point that in British Columbia, like most of the world, the wealth of the richest 1% has grown exponentially in recent decades, while the majority have found their income stagnant or even declining. The top 10% in BC now hold 56.2% of the wealth, and by the end of the evening, it will be 56.9% of the wealth. That's a greater share than anywhere else in Canada. To illustrate the wide-ranging ramifications of inequality, Andrew has interviewed economists, politicians, policymakers, and activists, as well as those living on the edge, to provide a poignant, in-depth exploration of poverty and inequality in BC and its possible solutions, emphasis on solutions. Better Place on Earth argues that British Columbians are living with the consequences of short-sighted public policies, and adjusting those policies can achieve a different set of results. So what I thought we would do this evening is that Andrew would read from his book or discuss parts of his book for a bit, and then Iglika will give about a 5 or 10 minute presentation of some of her perspective on this. Then we'll sit here and chat a bit, and I'll ask a few questions, but not too many, because I really want to let the audience get involved in this. So I'm determined to leave, half hour, 40 minutes at least for questions from the audience, which is more than usual. Usually you guys get about 6 minutes, if I've been to enough of these. So let's try to avoid that tonight. So Andrew MacLeod, would you like to come up and tell us about your book?
Hi, thank you, David. How's the volume? I'm not sure how far I should be from that. You hear me okay? Thank you, everyone, for coming. It's nice to see such a nice crowd. Lots of familiar faces, lots of people I don't know, too. I should get my notes out. Some people ask me why I write, and it's usually because when I speak, I put my foot in my mouth or I get nervous. So this is why I write. And you write a book, and people ask you to come talk about it. It's a very strange thing. So I'm going to read a bit. I'm going to talk a bit. I'm going to start by reading, I think, because that's as good a way as any to get into it. So from the introduction, and I won't read the whole book, I promise. On weekends, I often bicycle for a few hours around British Columbia's capital regional district. The ride inevitably takes me past the gates of waterfront mansions, through First Nations communities marked by rundown homes, alongside marinas harboring yachts worth millions, and past a line of people waiting to get into a downtown shelter for a meal or a place to sleep. To say that there is inequality in British Columbia, a wealthy province that the government has at times promoted as the best place on earth, is to state the obvious. Like me on my weekend ride, you can see massive wealth alongside dire poverty for yourself pretty much anywhere in the province, often within a few blocks of each other. More than one person I spoke to for this book described following Hastings Street in Vancouver eastward until both buildings and people became distinctly shabbier. Within a block, you go from high-end jewelry stores to payday loan businesses and shops with bars over their windows. In Prince George, it's a short drive from the hardscrabble downtown to a bustling mall, then out half an hour to homes by the Mud River that list for more than $1 million each. Kelowna, which boasts winery tourism and swish lakefront properties, also features people living in some 2,400 mobile homes. A childhood friend living in Kamloops tells me the north side of town is best avoided. In British Columbia, like elsewhere, the wealth of the richest 1% has grown exponentially in recent decades, while the majority have found their income stagnant at best or even declining. As seems to have become normal in North America, many in the middle feel they are working harder without getting ahead. While the wealth and celebrity of our richest is the stuff of fawning headlines, the stories run beside others about the persistence of child poverty and the continued reliance of many on food banks. Our richest have wealth that is counted in the billions, while others sleep in downtown doorways. So, best of times, worst of times. That's pretty much where it starts. My friends who've published books before tell me the one question everyone wants answered is, well, why did you write this book? You know, why you, why this book? And there are at least three answers to that. One is sort of the prosaic. I've been a journalist for, well, depending what you count, I mean, full-time since probably 2002, freelance since 1995, student press starting in 1991 or something like that. And part of that, the specific series, as Dave said, this came out of a series that I wrote for the Tyee that we published, I think it was a year ago, February. So it started with an assignment from Dave, so he actually gets a lot of credit for its existence as well. I don't think it would exist without him having given it that push, and without him having created the space along with Michelle to put together these kinds of long-form journalism. I don't know how many journalists get a chance to write series of 15,000 words, 10 pieces. It's sort of a disappearing niche, I think, in our media today. And the other piece of that is Howard White saw the series and said, hey, would you like to turn that into a book? Which was easy enough to say yes. But beyond that, there's sort of a long-term interest in economic justice. I've been telling the story of, I remember when I was about 8 years old being downtown with my father and seeing people begging on the street and asking, well, what's that about? And this would have been around 1980 or so. And his answer was, well, this is Canada. We have a social safety net. You really don't need to worry that much. So as a reporter, I've had the chance to do research and test that out and see to what degree that's true. Yeah. And I mean, obviously in BC, and the third part to that answer is that this is a global issue. You can list off the World Economic Forum. As Iglika and I were on Voice of BC together, and Iglika pointed out that the World Economic Forum had named as the #1 threat to the global economy growing inequality is. Mark Carney, the governor of the Bank of England, has named it as a problem. Ed Clark, when he was retiring as the president of the TD Bank, said it was a major threat. The BC Business Council has described it as a big problem for the province. So it's this international problem, but then when we look at BC, we have a very interesting case study because of the way it's played out here. And I'm not going to use a lot of slides, but I did bring two that I wanted to share. So do I have control of that? Does anyone know? If we could go to the first slide, that would be great. Or do I have control? Okay, thanks, Alan. Where do I do it? How do I have control? Oh, there we go. All right, so all I had to do was push one button. That's good. I pushed the right one. So this is a chart of the Gini coefficient. The Gini coefficient is it's a scale from 0 to 1. 1 would be total inequality, where one person had all the wealth, and a 0 would be total equality. The black line is the Gini coefficient for Canada, and you can see that from the sort of the 70s through the 80s and 90s, it sort of went up and stayed up. BC, you can see we started out sort of below the average, and then we spiked way above it, sort of around 2001, 2002, somewhere in there, and then stayed high as well. And the Gini coefficient, it's a little bit sterile, right? Like when I hear a number for it, it doesn't mean a whole lot to me. You can't really put a face to it. So I brought this other chart that helps as well. Oh, no, that's not the one I wanted. Oh, that's a detail question. That's a good one for the economist that's joining us, Dave. So this isn't actually the other slide I wanted. The other one, there's one for child poverty, which actually tracks very similar to the Gini coefficient. We sort of go along underneath the average, and then again, sort of 2000, 2001-ish, we spike above. And I'm going to go back to the main page, I think, if I can. So, yeah, the book goes into a lot of the sort of the roots of inequality and the consequences and that sort of thing, and I'm not going to talk about that a lot tonight until I expect the question and answer period. But I have another section I'd like to read to you. One of the sources of inequality is the difference between what people are paid at the top end of the spectrum and what people are paid at the bottom. This comes out of the section I'm going to read comes out of a conversation with my uncle, who I'm not saying he's a 1%er, but he does smoke a cigar on the way to work in the morning. So the merit argument came up when I was talking about inequality with a conservative relative who works in the financial industry in the United States. He asked why the Vancouver Canucks can get along and cohere together when the top paid player makes many more times than the worst. Despite the possible awkwardness, they seem to gel as a hockey team, he said. He has a point. While the Sedin twins, Daniel and Henrique, were contracted to each make $7 million in 2014-15, their teammate Ryan Stanton would make $550,000, or about $1 for every $13 the Sedins made. Stanton is a defenseman who scored 1 goal in 64 games he played in the 2013-14 season. The implication is that hockey players are paid based on merit, their salaries reflecting their value to the team and their relative contributions to success. To extend that to the broader economy and argue that pay always reflects merit is a stretch, however. I'm reminded of American baseball player Babe Ruth reportedly explaining that why his salary demand of $80,000 was more than the $70,000 that President Herbert Hoover made at the time. I know, but I had a better year than Hoover. Stanton, who is no Babe Ruth, stood to make about $225,000 more than Prime Minister Stephen Harper in 2014. No doubt there are those who would argue he had a better year than Harper. Yeah, and then there's a little bit of stuff. Thomas Piketty discusses at length in Capital in the 21st Century that in many professions it's not so easy to determine individuals' value to their company or to the society. And as Bank of England Governor Mark Carney put it in a 2014 speech, returns in a globalized world are amplifying the rewards of the superstar, and though few of them would be inclined to admit it, the lucky. And the best rejoinder may be to point out, as others have, that in the financial crash of 2008, many of the people who helped bring on the crisis received huge bonuses. Whatever that is, it's not a system based on merit. And the other thing I'd say, like, I wish I'd realized this when I was writing the book, but 13-1, which is what the ratio would be with the Canucks, is actually pretty good. Like Lee Valley, they get credit for paying it about 12-1. And Switzerland last year had a referendum where they were trying to bring the ratio down to 12-1 as well. So it's sort of seen as a goal. We're in the Gold Corps Center of the Arts here, so I'm going to pick on Charles Jean. I'm not sure if he says Jean or Jeans, the CEO. He made $10.2 million in the last year, for which we have figures. I don't know what they pay their workers in Guatemala, where there's been all kinds of issues around the mine. But if it's $30,000 a year, which it probably isn't, we're looking at a ratio of something like 350-1. And if it's more like 20,000, it probably isn't even that. It would be 500-1. So the Canucks are, relatively closely paid compared to, most corporations in our world today. So as I said, I'm going to skip over the causes and consequences, assuming that's going to come up more. And I'm just going to read you one last section, because as Dave said, it is solutions-oriented. There's a list of 36 or so possible things you could do if you had the will to do them. And it is overall fairly optimistic. So I'm just going to read a little bit of that section to you. The first thing to know about addressing inequality is that experts who study the issue say it matters much more that it is done than how it is done. The second is that there are countless public policy options that would make our societies more equal if there were the political will to put them in place. And while some will tell you that tackling inequality is difficult or complicated, the basics are dead simple. Anything that constrains incomes at the top or raises them at the bottom will make people more equal. Often, as Iglika Ivanova at the BC office of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives pointed out to me, the solutions are the flip side of the causes of inequality. If we got to where we are by lowering taxes, stagnating low-income wages, escalating top incomes, and shrinking unions, it's easy to see what's needed to change direction. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Iglika. And I should just say, too, I'm very glad that she's here today. As I researched the book, I interviewed her at least once or twice and found that as I did the research, the CCPA was usually 2, 3, 4 steps ahead of me. So I'm glad you're here.
Thank you. Okay, can everyone hear me? Thanks everyone for coming. It's great to see so many people who've come on this, not quite very sunny, but still very pleasant evening to listen to us talk about inequality and see what this book is about. And thanks, and Andrew, for including me in the book launch. It's really an honor to have a chance to share some of my research and thinking about Canada's growing inequality, because this is one of the topics that is very near and dear to my heart. And in fact, it's one of the reasons why I became an economist, is my interest in income inequality. You see, I was born and raised in Bulgaria, which is on the other side of the Iron Curtain from where we're sitting today. And I grew up during the time of transition from old Soviet bloc to democracy and free markets. So, as you well know, there were many problems with the political and economic system of the Soviet bloc. But when I started grade 1, all my friends' parents had jobs, everyone had decent housing and food on the table, and all our grandparents had a secure retirement. Fast forward to grade 7, things were very different. We had transitioned to a market economy, to a democracy, but it also transitioned to a much more unequal society. And a society in which mass unemployment was commonplace, in which there were now beggars on the streets, something I did not remember from my childhood, and there were grandmas rummaging through the city garbage bins looking for food scraps. So that's what democracy looked like to me as a teenager. And meanwhile, there were muscular young men in black suits with sunglasses, thick gold chains, and expensive new cars, and they became the face of a Bulgarian business. That was the businessman. So, the contrast between the grandmas in the garbage bins and those young, muscular men, former wrestlers or, boxers from the Olympic Bulgarian teams, who were now businessmen, was huge. And so I thought as a teenager, wow, what a jarring example of how a shift in economic and social priorities can really make an immediate and very large impact on people's daily lives. And even though I didn't know much about anything at that time, I thought there's got to be a better way. This can't possibly be the pinnacle of the free market. There's got to be a better way. And so I wanted to study and to figure out what the better way is. And I was lucky enough to get a scholarship to come to Canada to this amazing 2-year program on Vancouver Island called Pearson College. And that's where I took my first economics course. And I was hooked because economics provided me with a framework to explain what was happening in my country, from the long lines for bread and vegetable oil to the mass unemployment and income inequality. So I decided that I would become an economist so I can help my country. But one of the biggest cultural shocks I experienced when I came to university here in Vancouver is seeing East Hastings, is seeing the level of homelessness and economic insecurity out on the street in a rich country. I thought this was something that only exists in the global south and in countries like Bulgaria. But as I learned more about economics and about Canada, it became clear to me that it's not just the global south and Eastern Europe that suffers from poorly designed economic policies, and that can be doing better. But it's rich countries like Canada too. So I decided to become an economist so I can understand how this all works and try to fix it, because there's got to be a better way. And I'm sure you're all here tonight because you think there's got to be a better way. And so let me tell you what I have found here. I found an incredible organization to work for called the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. How many of you have heard of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives? Oh, very good, about 3/4. For those of you who haven't, our office is across the street, Hastings and Cambie. We are an independent, non-partisan research institute concerned with issues of social, economic, and environmental justice. We have a national office in Ottawa, and we have provincial offices in BC, in Manitoba, Ontario, Saskatchewan, and Nova Scotia. So we cover most of the country, though we are looking to expand. We look at some of the key challenges facing Canada and how we can address them in a way that unites Canadians rather than dividing them, which is something we see a lot. And we have done a lot of work on income inequality, so if you're interested, you should check out their website. But I want to share a couple of big projects with you tonight. Every January, we publish a report on CEO pay, and Andrew started talking a little bit about that. But the latest report found that by lunchtime of the first official working day of the year, so January 2nd usually, Canada's top 100 paid CEOs have already earned what it takes an average Canadian full-time, full-year worker a whole year to earn. Okay, by lunchtime on the first day of the working year. So what this means is the latest year for which we have data now is 2013, and the Canada's 100 highest paid CEOs made 195 times more than the average Canadian worker, and 237 times more than the average Canadian woman working full year full time. Because unfortunately in the 21st century Canada, women are still paid less than men. So think about this for a minute. We're not talking here about everyone being equal. We all know different jobs take different amounts of effort, preparation, skill. We all can think of someone who maybe works twice as hard as us, or maybe 3 times as hard as us, or maybe twice as long, although we all have 24 hours at the end of the day. But can you think of someone working 195 times harder? And remember, these CEOs are not earning 195 times more than the laziest, most incompetent, slowest worker ever. They're earning 195 times more than the average Canadian full-time, full-year worker. This is what we're talking about. But it hasn't always been this way. In '95, so only 20 years ago, Canada's top 50 CEOs made 85 times more than the average worker. So we went from 85 to 195 times over 20 years. And going even further back to the late 80s, when the Berlin Wall was falling in Eastern Europe, here, top United States CEOs, we don't have data for Canada, unfortunately, but the US CEOs generally get paid more than Canadians. And in 1980, they made 40 times more than the average worker. So we went from 40 to 195 times more than the average worker. So inequality is growing very rapidly. It hasn't always been this way. This isn't the story of, the rich get richer, the poor get poorer. Something different is happening since the mid-'80s in North America. And that's why we're here this evening. So, wealth inequality. So this is income, how much you earn. But as you earn more, you can save more. So wealth inequality is also a huge problem that we've written about. Our latest report on wealth inequality is called Outrageous Fortune. Pretty much tells you what it is about. And it finds that the richest 86 Canadians have so much wealth they can buy all the assets in the province of New Brunswick. 86 people. So we have huge inequalities, and BC is the most unequal province in terms of wealth. I decided not to use charts tonight, partly to avoid the technical difficulties and the experience, and partly to, push myself to do something different. I always use charts if you've seen me speak. But instead, I will just tell you that it doesn't matter how many charts I show you. There's Gini coefficients, you can look at the share of income earned by the top 1%, and all these charts point to the same thing. There is an increasing concentration of income and wealth in the hands of very few people. And another way to think about what is happening is to realize that the economic growth we've experienced, and we have experienced a lot of economic growth over the last 30 years, it just hasn't trickled down. It has been captured largely by the people at the top, which is why they're earning so much more now than your average worker. So in Canada, there was recently a report by the OECD that showed that since between 1975 and the recession, so in these like 25 years or 30 years, 1/3 of all economic growth went to the top 1%. 1/3. And fully 2/3 of all economic growth in Canada went to the top 10%. And the bottom 90%, we got to divide 1/3 of economic growth. And this hasn't been the case in every country. In Denmark, for example, which has the same income per capita as Canada, the bottom 90% got 90% of the benefit of economic growth. And the top 1% got 1%. So, and then all the European countries are, in between us, and then the United States is even bigger, where almost half of all growth was captured by the top 1%. So, we're not as bad as the United States, and a lot of people find this as a consolation. They'd say, well, the US is doing worse, so nothing to worry about, let's go home and celebrate. But the fact that Canada remains more equal than the United States is no reason to pat ourselves on the back. In fact, there's many countries that are a lot more equal than Canada is. And there's countries like Germany where when you look at the distribution of wages, it is actually slightly more unequal than Canada's. But when you look at the distribution of after-tax income, it is considerably more equal. That's because even though a lot of us think of ourselves as, we're Canadian, we're not as bad as the United States, we have a social safety net, we take care of the poor, but that has been eroded over the last 30 years to a very large extent. And so we actually don't redistribute income quite as much as most people think. We're actually at the bottom of developed OECD countries when they're ranked based on how much they redistribute income. So we're becoming less generous, and our wages are becoming more polarized. So these are the problems. I think it's very important to remember that, yes, there are global factors that drive inequality. There's technological change, there's globalization, there's liberalization of trade, but they affect all countries in the world. And some of them have made different choices with their policies, and so they're seeing less inequality. So instead of celebrating that we're better than the United States, we should be asking, what can we do to be like those other countries that are doing so much better than us? And I hope that we get to talk about this later this evening. Thank you.
Did you ever explain what the Gini coefficient even was? You just said how we're doing. I didn't know if that was a good or a bad thing, that we were higher or lower. What does that mean?
The higher it is, the more unequal we are.
Okay.
So it's a scale of 0 to 1, and
Okay.
1 would be total inequality, and 0 would be total equality.
Right.
How it's calculated, that's probably a question
that
for
was
Iglika.
That wasn't really what I meant. I just meant, what does it mean? Yeah.
And the point I was working towards is there was a similar chart with child poverty, where it sort of tracks along under the Canadian average, and again sort of goes way up above. Sort of child poverty got higher everywhere, but more so in Canada, in BC than the rest of Canada. And I think like when we talk about the Gini coefficient, we can't really picture what that means. But when we talk about children being poor, we have a better idea of what that means. We're talking about kids with not enough to eat, showing up at school and that kind of thing, having a hard time. Fitting in socially and all the things that come along with growing up in poverty. So that was the point I was working towards there.
Great. So in looking at this issue, the dominant narrative that comes back over and over again is if you try to counter some of the forces that are creating inequality, what you do is you drain away kind of incentive for investment, for job creation. And after all, you may be interested in talking about, both of you, about macro policy options that can redistribute wealth. But first, the wealth has to be created, and we want to have jobs. And so
you're sounding like Christy Clark.
I'd like to put that straight out to you. I know how you become the term for getting a job and single-handedly countering the trend of inequality is social mobility. It's a term that means how easy is it for you to move from here to here in a wealth or income table. And I know what the key to social mobility is in Bulgaria. You become a wrestler. Because Iglika explained that tonight, and up to this point I did not know. And if I were in Bulgaria, that is what I would be doing right now. But let's just assume we're here, and let me ask you this: how does BC score in terms of social mobility? Like, we may be unequal, but how easy is it to move from the lower realms of wealth or income up to the higher ones?
Yeah. Could I just address the first point? You were talking about, first you have to generate prosperity. This is when the BC Business Council looked at it. That's what they got to as well. And the question I would ask is, well, when? How much prosperity is enough before you start making different decisions and sharing it more? On the question of social mobility, we know that there's a curve called the Great Gatsby curve, where it charts inequality against social mobility. And in general, the more unequal a country is, the less social mobility there is, the less likely children are to make more money than their parents. Canada is a bit of an outlier. We have sort of higher inequality, but we still have pretty good social mobility. Miles Korak, who's done a lot of the work on this, I think he's at McMaster University, back east somewhere. The point he makes is what we see on our intergenerational mobility scores has a lot to do with where things were at 20 or 30 years ago. We're seeing the result of a time when things were more equal in Canada. And the question is, well, where are we going? As we become less equal, will we see that change? And certainly the experience elsewhere would suggest that we will.
Iglika, what are the countries that have the most social mobility, and what are they doing right?
The countries that have the most social mobility are actually the Nordic countries, the Northern European
Not them again.
Yes,
Oh,
them
geez.
again. And what they're doing right is providing services
Wrestling
that
training.
everyone,
Oh, I'm
not
sorry.
wrestling
Okay.
training, no,
Okay.
that's Bulgarian.
Okay.
But services for children of all families, regardless of their family income. So, or say early childhood education or public education and healthcare. And in fact, this is one of the reasons why Canada has much better social mobility than the United States, is that everyone here gets access to healthcare. And our public schools are still relatively good compared to what's happening in the public education system in the United States. And so the problem with focusing only on social mobility is that the more unequal a society is, the less opportunities there are for social mobility, because there start to be pressures to erode the services that we provide to everyone, to privatize education, to privatize healthcare, and to actually make it more difficult for kids to escape the circumstance that they're born in. So in fact, we are eroding some of those very policies that make us better than the United States, and in 20 years we can expect to be just as bad. I mean, look at schools. We have overcrowded classrooms. We have no supports or not enough supports for kids that need extra help to learn well. And what this means is that if your parents can pay for counseling, or if your parents can pay for private tutoring, then you get a head start. And if they can't, well, you're left behind. So this is what will reduce our social mobility. Basically depends on the resources your family has. And not on public
that runs
programs.
counter to what I think a lot of people assume, including myself, which is that one of the trade-offs, if you have a lot of inequality, at least you have a very dynamic economy where there's lots of opportunity and a chance to zoom up the ladder. What you've just told me is that these damn Nordic countries that have these big fat middle classes also they're very dynamic because people are moving about. They're socially mobile, more so than here.
Yeah, definitely. And there's another good point that you made that I want to address. This whole idea of a trade-off between economic growth and inequality. It used to be the case that when I went to university, not that long ago, that's what we were taught. Yes, you can have a more equal society, but you have to sacrifice economic growth. That's just how it works. But now we know that's not the case. There has been recent research, including not just from CCPA, but from the International Monetary Fund, from the OECD, from the Conference Board of Canada, a business think tank, that shows that actually having high levels of income inequality is bad for the economy. The IMF study, for example, has shown that countries with higher levels of income inequality experience shorter periods of economic growth, more volatility, and so over the long run, their economies grow less than countries that have higher levels of equality. And there was recently a study by the International Monetary Fund published last year called Redistribution, Inequality, and Growth, if you want to look it up, and which shows that actually redistributive policies don't have, don't sacrifice economic growth, that you can redistribute and you will be fine economically, unless you go to extremes, which is nowhere close to where Canada finds itself. So we have a lot of room to redistribute without hurting growth, without sacrificing the dynamism of the economy. And in fact, we will help our economy if we were to redistribute a little bit more.
The thought experiment I sometimes give on that is, if you take $1 million and you set up policies so that one person ends up with that $1 million, they may be invested in something that creates jobs, or maybe they stick it somewhere where it essentially becomes dead money. We have a lot of money that's not particularly active in the economy. But if you give $1,000 to 1,000 people who are in need, they go out and they spend it on things they need, and it works its way through the economy, and probably ends up with that person who would have ended up with it if you just gave the $1 million to one person anyway. But it does some good in between.
Now, I've had a lot of conversations with Andrew over the years where I'll say, Andrew, I'm thinking this and that, and I'm connecting dots this way, and you're our politics reporter, so why don't you write an article that kind of says this? And Andrew says, Dave, that sounds like a column to me that a pundit would write. I'm a reporter. I don't opinionate. Too bad. You're up here now. I'm going to ask you to opinionate a bit. You're such a close observer of politics. The second most unequal place in Canada is right next door, and they just had an interesting election. Did people vote against inequality in this last election in Alberta, do you think?
Okay, I'll give you reporters. Yeah, that's a total columnist thing. Gary Mason could do that. What I would say is I'm not sure exactly how many voters there are in Alberta, but in BC, because I was asked this about BC as well. I think when we were on Von Palmer's show on Voice of BC, he asked, we had an election here. Didn't people reject fighting inequality? And what I would say is, we're a province of 4.5 million people, 2.5 million or so of whom voted, 1.3 million or so of whom voted for the winning side. How much can you generalize about, what each of those people voted for? So I think I'm not in Alberta, and I didn't follow it, as a reader, not as a reporter. And my sense is that people voted to throw the Progressive Conservatives out, and it became clear that the NDP were the alternative. It's hard to know how much was a vote against. The government was falling, they got out of the way, and how much of it was a vote for. That said, I think it'll be very interesting to see what they do.
But weren't now? See,
how's that?
Now I have to edit Andrew. You see, so. To me, like a couple of the themes that the NDP ran hard on that Wild Rose did not was wealth redistribution. We're going to raise corporate taxes. We're going to extract more royalties. There was according to one article that I read in a very credible source, the Tyee, NDP campaigners kept running into people in their homes when they knocked on their door who knew about Norway. And knew that Norway had done a totally different better job of redistributing and first of all, claiming and then redistributing petro wealth, and that was top of mind for a lot of voters. So I have to think that some of this economic redistribution was part of the campaign.
Would I say, was it a factor for some voters? Yes, yeah. Yes, of course, of course. Is it a solid way to explain the behavior of millions of people? No.
Okay.
Add into that. Okay, so Wild Rose. They looked like they were going to form the government the last time, and then they had a bunch of people across the floor and did their best to look like not trustworthy. In the 6 months or a year before the election, there were other factors. Is all I'm saying.
Well, I think the reason I'm asking is that it seems to me that some political will is going to have to be mustered, and this is going to have to become a very top-of-mind political issue for the changes to occur. And maybe we should talk about some of those changes so we get a sense of how heavy the lifting would be. If I were to ask you, Ivana, and then you, Andrew, each for your three favorite solutions for counteracting the trend towards inequality, what would you propose? Start with Iglika.
I don't know if they have a favorite solution. I think Andrew alluded to this earlier. The most important thing is to formulate this as a priority and to start doing something. And eventually you will get to a positive start, because as you build momentum towards reducing inequality, it just gets easier and easier. But there's two basic ways the government can go about it. One is to look at the labor market, which we said that is becoming more unequal. You know, there's stagnating wages at the bottom, or very low minimum wages in many places, and a very high executive compensation. So the inequality is partially coming from the labor market. So you can look at policies that will make the distribution of wages more equal. Mm-hmm. So we can look at things like making it easier for workers to actually enforce the rights that they possess. So for example, in BC, if you are employed and your employer breaks the rules and is breaking the law, essentially, your options are to go on the website of BC Employment Services and download a 9-page self-help form, which you fill out with your complaint, and then you take to your manager to complain. And then you can get fired for complaining, and there's nothing you can do. But that is the only thing you can do, really. Before this was introduced in 2002 or 2003, the government's employment services office would go and make proactively inspections in different workplaces to see if the rules are being followed. That was ended, and complaints fell by 60% over 2 years.
So your first one is empower workers to demand a fair wage. Okay, what's second?
Yeah, minimum wage. The other thing you can do is redistribute after the fact. So looking at the tax policy. And so basically we're looking at the things that played out in Alberta, for example, increasing taxes on higher income people, on corporations, considering resource royalties, reviewing how much are we charging for our natural resources. And I would add things like taxes on inheritance taxes, so that we don't pass the wealth from generation to generation. So things like this we can look at.
All right. Andrew?
Yeah.
We've got inheritance taxes and worker rights, making it easier for them to...
Yeah, I agree vigorously with Iglika. From a pragmatic point of view, and again, there's a list of 30-something solutions in the book, and I don't think it matters. Like I do believe that it doesn't matter how you do it. Just anything that reins in incomes at the top and shares it at the bottom or strengthens the middle will do it. From a pragmatic point of view, if it was me, I would probably start with raising welfare rates. You can do things like raise minimum wages up to a level where they're living wages. That's something the CCPA has done a lot of work on. Supporting childcare, I think, would be a big one. And then to pay for it, all you have to pay for it somehow. So taxes on corporations and high-income earners, inheritance taxes are all good things. Now, my most mischievous suggestion in the book was that politicians should be paid the median income. So the median individual income in BC is something like $30,000, and the median family income is like 60, 70,000, something like that. An MLA in BC makes 100,000 just to be on the backbench. If you're the party whip or the caucus chair or something, you get a little more. If you're a cabinet minister, you get, I think it's 150,000. If you're the premier, 180, 190,000. So mischievously, I suggest, well, pay them the median income. Then if the median person in BC does better, then they do better. And I thought I was, being funny. And then in my research for the book, I discovered that they actually do this in I think it was Alabama, which I'm not sure if that's an argument in its favor or not. But they do it, and for all the reasons that I was saying, if the average person in the state does better, then the politicians do better, and that makes sense. So
great. All right, well, let's turn it over to the audience. I have lots of questions I could be asking, but then we'll use up all the time, like I said we weren't going to do. Let's start here. And speak really loudly, because we're not, I don't...
I'm very curious about the notion of guaranteed basic incomes, and I'm wondering if you could comment on how that may be helpful or useful.
What's up with guaranteed basic incomes? Start with Iglika.
Right. The guaranteed basic income, does everyone know what that is? It's the idea that we give everyone a certain amount, regardless of whether they work or not. And it's just a guarantee for being a resident or a citizen. And this is one thing that definitely will have an impact. I mean, it depends. Again, this is one of those policies where the devil's in the details. Well, how big is the amount, and do other programs get cut? But in general, it should help at the low end. It should help boost incomes at the bottom. It should make it not so risky to lose your job, so it will provide a basic level of economic security. It won't do anything at the top, though, and that's one thing that I think is important to consider, that there's two separate problems we're dealing with. One is poverty, and child poverty, but adult poverty as well, and that's bad. But inequality is separate from poverty. It's not just about some people not having enough to eat and not having housing or not being able to participate in society. This is bad and should be addressed. But there is something more to inequality, to just having this concentration of income in the hands of so few. That guaranteed annual income won't change, right? So it's not the only, it's part of a package perhaps, and we have recommended it before in the reports that I've written, but it's part of a package. On its own, it's not gonna be the solution.
And in some ways, it appeals to people on the right side of the spectrum as well. Like Milton Friedman has talked about it as a way to shrink government, right? You get rid of all the social service, sort of the array of social services you have now, and you do it all in a efficient, one check to each person. One of the things I like about it is I think it would free people up to do creative things a lot more. People who want to make art or write poetry would have a lot more, support to do that, which I think would be nice.
There was a experiment in Saskatchewan. A town was, what was it? Or Manitoba? Yeah, okay, Manitoba. What was the name of the town?
Dauphin.
Dauphin. And it was in the 70s, wasn't it? Okay, I got that right. And 1 out of 3, that's what we aim for. Anyway, for a short while, everybody was given a guaranteed income. And then I read a very interesting piece. I can't remember where I found it, but it was looking back at the difference that had made in people's life, and they were all very positive about that brief shining moment when they had it.
Yeah, and most people, I think, carried on doing what they did before. There were sort of a few small subgroups that sort of stopped working, but for the most part, people kept doing what they were doing.
I like Iglika's point about how if you don't pay attention to how much wealth is concentrated at the very top, then you're not paying attention to how wealth flows then back through the economy. And one of Piketty's arguments is that too much wealth is now being bottled up by people who really don't want to do anything with it other than store it in one form of capital storage or another. One of them seems to be, I was going to say, one of them happens to be condos and houses in Vancouver, in Hedge City, as Andy Ann called it. Next question. Anybody else?
I was just curious about fear as a factor here in terms of the electorate, because traditional arguments from the business establishment are, we know what's going on and trust us. We'll give you the prosperity. Don't aggravate us. We can make supreme decisions. And the BBC, or one of their columnists or writers, in reviewing the last election, analyzed it with the explanation that the voters were fearful of what they would supposedly lose with the Tories not being re-elected. And HSBC from time to time threatens and continues to threaten to move their world headquarters out of London. So there's all that specter of, all these jobs are going to disappear, you socialists, communists, freakos, or whatever it is. So I think that's got to be a significant factor, and I'm just wondering how you would counter that, because you have the logical arguments, but there's also emotional, and that's very much a part of decision-making by the electorate. Thank you.
And certainly you saw that in Alberta as well. I mean, you had the oil executives and such talking about what an NDP victory would mean, and people voting the way they did anyway. And I would say that kind of thing has been a factor in BC as well, where the business community makes clear what they want. I'm not sure how many people vote that way, and I would say like elections are very muddy, you know, and when you look at the fact that I think we had 55% turnout in the last BC election, and the one before that it was 50%, and a lot of it has to do with the messages that the parties are giving to people and what's getting through, and you know, there's a lot of, there are many factors, I guess, that go into each person voting, and I do think fear is one of the factors for sure.
When you're debating or trying to articulate a counter to these fear-based arguments, Iglika, what do you tend to cite?
Well, I like to cite the IMF's paper about how income inequality is actually hurting our economy, and it's actually hurting our democracy as well. We have more and more research now, and even the business community is acknowledging it. If you look at what the BC Business Council is publishing, for example, a couple of years ago, they had this big report called BC Agenda for Shared Prosperity. And so even they're starting to kind of talk about the fact that we should be sharing the prosperity a little bit better than we are. And it is hurting them too, because when people don't have enough incomes, they don't go to the local business to shop. And so business is not as good as it would be if people had more income in their pockets. But I think you're onto something about democracy and voting, because countries with high levels of inequality tend to have lower voter turnout and less trust in institutions. But also, this concentration of income and it leads to a concentration of power. So why is it that the business interests can make their voices heard very loudly whenever they feel like it, and groups that lobby for, say, poverty reduction have a much harder time getting the time of day in the media? You know, it has to do with money. Money buys you access to politicians, even in countries like Canada, where we have more strict rules around campaign finance and what you're allowed to spend during elections. But it's still the case that, you know, if you can own media, if you can own, you know, or you buy PR companies to make advertising and messaging for you, then everyone knows what the business sector thinks. Does everyone know what, you know, low-income people think about something, or what students think about something, or what immigrant women think about something? No. Why not? Income inequality is one of the reasons.
Thank you.
So, but isn't that a question then of assuming that the politician is not then beholden to those who have the wealth? I mean, they are told how to make decisions. Otherwise, the wealth stops flowing into their pockets and giving them better, more effective campaigns for elections.
Now, Andrew will tell me I'm wrong about this, but Rachel Notley did run on eliminating corporate and union donations to politicians. Now, of course, that had no effect, and that had nothing to do with why people voted, because it's all very complicated, but in my view, that might have had something to do with it. Anyway.
No argument.
I think we should definitely look at campaign finance. And this is another place where different countries differ a lot in their laws. Like in the United States, you can spend whatever you want on campaigning, and corporations are people and they have the right to free speech. So you would see that politicians are a lot more beholden to wealth there than they are in other places like Canada, where we have more limitations. Even though there's corporate donations and union donations, there's still limits. So you can't have what you're seeing now in the United States with the Koch brothers saying that two old white men can warn or threaten to spend more than any of the political parties that represent millions of Americans and fundraise from, you know, so many people. And two guys can outspend them because,
The politicians do respond to where the public is at to some degree, though. I say this as somebody who covers the legislature. And you look at, for instance, the Liberals after 2001, there were sort of 2 or 3 years there where they did what Gary Collins described as the heavy lifting, of big tax cuts, big service cuts. And pretty quickly, the NDP were back polling even with them, despite the fact that it was 77 seats to 2 in the legislature. The polls sort of evened up again, and they sort of went, oh, I guess we can't do a whole lot more heavy lifting. So even the people who make big donations, they'd come knocking on the doors and looking for things that were maybe not in the public interest, and they would get the response of, well, we'd love to help you, but we'll get turfed out in the next election. So there is, despite how the process gets biased or pushed or corrupted, there are limits on it, I think. We do have the vestiges of a democracy.
We have the vestiges of democracy. That's hopeful.
Thanks, Dan.
You pick.
Hi. I have a question for maybe Iglika. Yes. You mentioned the healthcare. You think only the northern countries have the best healthcare in the world? Don't you think New Zealand and Australia, Singapore, other southern countries have good healthcare? Don't you think like northern countries can compete with them?
I'm just saying northern countries because they usually are the top ranked in all the different rankings the OECD puts out. But Australia, New Zealand, always usually, most of the time rank better than Canada on a lot of the indicators. They are more equal and they have better supports for many people. It depends. It's just a generalization to just say Nordic countries because those are at the top. But generally speaking, Canada is ranked towards the bottom of the OECD countries in terms of inequality. And the problem is what's happening now when we have all this pressure to say reduce deficits, both federally and provincially, and we're trying to save money by cutting services, then what is this going to lead to in the future?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. What happened to Keynesian spending? This idea that when times are tough, as they were in 2009, Canada's very proud of itself because it decided that it would sort of run a bit of a deficit, but not such a large one. And now we're hearing a lot of bragging about that the budget is balanced. But my understanding is that governments can run deficits during tough times in order to shore up the middle class and eliminate inequality, and then spend that down later during better times. What's happened to that philosophy? Is that making a comeback a bit in public policy circles? Or?
I think it made a little bit of a comeback after the recession, and we did see deficits. And even in BC, where we have a balanced budget legislation, it got repealed to allow for deficits to be run. But the deficits were run for a very short period of time, and stimulus spending was offered for a very short time, and then it was withdrawn very quickly as soon as it looked like the economy was recovering. I would argue it was withdrawn too fast, and that's why we have seen an increase in income inequality through the recession, and poverty is not doing very well either. I think that a focus of just a narrow minded focus on reducing the deficit at all costs doesn't make any sense when you consider all the costs of, say, tolerating high levels of poverty or inequality, or dismantling some of our social services, or closing coast guards when we're going to increase, traffic in the port. So
when you hear deficit cutting or austerity budgets, you hear inequality widening.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Look at what's happened. One of the periods where inequality widened the most in Canada is over the 90s, like kind of mid-90s to mid-2000s, which was the big Paul Martin deficit reduction process. And so what happened was, in order to reduce the deficit, in the late 90s, we saw a lot of cuts to transfer to provinces, so transfers for education, for example, or other services, and transfers to individuals. So we made it harder to qualify for EI. We made it harder provincially to qualify for welfare. And then when we were able to reduce spending enough to have a balanced budget, and then times turned good, instead of reinvesting back into those services, what we did was we gave tax cuts that benefited the wealthy. And a similar thing happened in BC in early 2000s, except we started with the tax cuts, then we had a deficit, and then we managed the deficit by cutting, social service budgets and And so we're at the point now where, say, welfare rates have not increased since 2007. Think about this. Since 2007, you get the same amount of dollars if you're on welfare. And with employment insurance, or EI, less than 40% of people who are unemployed qualify. I mean, how is that a functioning program if less than 40% of people get it?
I think this person had a question. Yeah.
Hi, I had a question. So I had a question about Canada's aging population and where the state of employment is at for young people, ages 19 to 30. At least from what I see, we don't get well-paid jobs. We don't get stability. A lot of people that I know are leaving Canada because the Canadian passport allows you to move and travel wherever you want. So the factors are not really in our favor to settle down and raise families here. Most of us don't expect to buy houses here ever. And our parents will expect to sell these over-speculated homes to people that ideally grew up here or know Canada fairly well. But I think the whole country is going to change a lot when our generation is at the age where they're supposed to settle down and they can't afford to. So how do you reflect on that?
Yeah, and you add student debt into that as well. Paul Kershaw at UBC's done a lot of really good work. His Generation Squeezed campaign, and yeah, youth unemployment rate is about double what it is for the general population. It's something like 7% for most of the population. It's around 14-15% for youth in BC. Even if you get the job, it pays the same as it would have 30 years ago, so the wage has stayed flat. At the same time, the price of a house or tuition or anything you might be buying has gone up significantly. So yeah, it's a huge challenge, and something that needs to be addressed. I think Paul Kershaw's answer on it is to, I mean, he actually, I think for the most part, stays away from touching tuition fees and such, but talks about focusing on childcare and things that help people out as they're starting a family, that kind of thing. Transfers to people at the age where they're starting to have children. But yeah, the real estate market's out of control in the Lower Mainland in particular, and Victoria as well. And I'm not sure that there's the appetite to apply the things like other places do things like Singapore has something like 80% of people living in social housing, like even sort of their executive housing is social housing. There are lots of things we could do to take some of that pressure off, and it would be, it's necessary for sure.
I'm wondering if you feel like when you make these statements, you're getting any resonance from people other than your age. Like, do you feel that that people take your concerns seriously, people who are in their 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, the political class, the people who are politicians? Do you feel like you're getting listened to at these feelings, or do you feel like you're just talking amongst your friends and not getting much take up? But use your, yeah.
When I do speak to people in their 40s, they're usually people with established careers that are here and that have families and that have been living here earlier than I have. Mm-hmm. And they went through a different career environment than I did. So they will quote their own story, and that story is no longer relevant.
Right.
And that's what I
think
hear.
That's a really great point. And here's a way in which income inequality scars the culture, some of the most basic elements we assume, which is the passing on of a consistent story of how somebody lives in our society. I mean, I wrote about this once in a column for the Globe and got a surprising response to it, because I said that I'm one of these people who lucked into a old craftsman house near Main Street, 20-some years ago, and it's ridiculous in terms of what it's worth. In the old days, a guy like me could have over my younger colleagues and friends, people your age, and feel great. It'd be like cooking burgers on the deck and pouring you a nice bottle of wine that I could afford, but you can't afford yet, but you're gonna. And we could all feel like, well, that's part of the whole process. I'm the good burger of Main Street, you know, sort of ushering in what could be yours someday. And now I don't invite folks over who are young because it's embarrassing. It's actually an insult. It's actually a very emotionally fraught situation. And I feel like that is a scar, that is a wound in our society that people rarely articulate, but I know I feel it. So yeah. Yeah.
Is it correct that Quebec traditionally has had lower levels of inequality? And I'm curious what you can say about what they do right there and why those things wouldn't be applicable here and couldn't be implemented here, and what the barriers to that might be.
My father and stepmother actually live in Quebec, and I hear a lot about how high the taxes are. So I think that's part of it. They do tax at a marginal rate that's significantly higher than anybody else, and then they share it through programs like $7 a day to childcare and things like that. There's a lot more commitment to that, and keeping tuition fees low, and all the things that sort of strengthen the community.
Yeah, definitely. All the data is there that shows that Quebec has lower levels of income inequality. Part of the reason is that they organize their social services very differently, and their taxes, and because they're culturally more distinct, that allows them kind of the freedom to do their own thing. And jurisdictionally, I mean, they, have been able to do their own thing for a long time in Canada. Other provinces have opted to kind of more do the same thing or be closer to the US. And some economists have argued that one of the reasons for Quebec being able to do what it does is that the linguistic reason is that there's less competition with the United States or pressure to increase wages, say, for executives, because those French-speaking executives can't necessarily go and get a job in the United States, as opposed to other provinces where there's the sentiment that there's direct competition in the job market here and in the United States. So, for example, my partner's in computing science, in tech, and more than half of his graduating class now works in the States, because in the States, the tech salaries are way higher than they are in Vancouver, and housing prices are lower. So they all went to work for, different tech companies in Seattle or in California. And we have these universities that they educate, a whole number of people every year who then move to the States to work. So that's one of the problems Canada faces, is that we're so close to the US, where some people can earn such higher incomes that it's hard for them to stay here unless they identify culturally with the province and they want to stay in Quebec because it's French speaking and the culture is the culture they are born in and want to maintain. And so for them, it's harder to move to the US. They give up too much, right? So that's one thing that, say, BC can't really leverage. It's harder to convince the young people to stay here in the expensive housing market.
One more question?
I don't have a question, I have an observation.
Okay.
That for decades, we have as a civilization have, like lemmings, voted for policies that harm us, that don't serve us well. Has anybody looked at, why do we do that?
It's Jim Prentice. Jim Prentice, you want to know what the problem is? Look in the mirror. He was right. We have, as you say, we've voted for generations for these policies that are, I think in some ways they're just very easy, right? Like when Christy Clark's out on the campaign trail and she says, I'm going to leave more money in your pocket, and we're going to create jobs. It's easy to express that, where it's a little harder to explain. If we all paid a little more tax and we shared it a bit more, we're all going to be better off. And I'm sure they're always working on how to communicate that in a really clear way. But in some ways it's tougher. And again, we have the political debate from the States, which is like ours, but even more extreme. But we all hear it every time there's an election there. We've gone through Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, and sort of the influence of the Chicago School of Economics, and it does become pervasive to the point where when people hear those arguments from Christy Clark, it sounds right. And it will take a lot of work to change that, I think.
I would suggest starting with buying 500 of Andrew's books, distributing them to the people that you think are least likely to already agree with you. Fortunately, those books are available outside, so, and if you're in the upper 1%, then I would say buy 1,000 books, so you can afford them, right? Also read what Iglika is producing at the CCPA. Sadly, we have to wrap up, but there's a reception afterwards. I want to thank, again, I want to thank the SFU Van City Office of Community Engagement for giving us this wonderful space this evening. I want to thank Zoe Graham and Harbor Publishing for also helping to put this on. And I want to thank Iglika and Andrew for being here tonight and being so insightful and interesting. Thanks very much, everybody.
And